Let me tell you something that took researchers decades to figure out. Intelligence doesn't peak in public. It peaks in private. The real markers of an exceptional mind aren't the quick answers, the confident opinions, or the impressive performance in a room full of people. They're what your brain does when absolutely no one is watching, when there's no reward on offer, no score being kept, and no audience to impress. Here are 6 of those markers. If you find yourself genuinely in this list, pay attention. You can sit with a question that has no answer. Not temporarily, not while you're searching for a resolution. Actually sit with it, for days, sometimes weeks, without the discomfort driving you toward a premature conclusion. The human brain is a prediction machine. Its primary job isn't to find truth, it's to reduce uncertainty. And when faced with a genuinely unresolvable question, most brains don't think harder. They grab the nearest available answer just to make the discomfort stop. Psychologists call this the need for cognitive closure. Epistemic patience, the ability to hold contradictory ideas without forcing a resolution, correlates directly with greater prefrontal cortex activity, the part of your brain responsible for complex reasoning. If you can genuinely say, "I don't know yet, and I'm okay with that," not as performance, but as an actual resting state, you have a cognitive capacity that most people spend their lives unconsciously avoiding. If this is landing, hit like. It helps this reach people who think this way and have never had a name for it. You actively look for evidence that you're wrong. Not in public, not performatively, privately, alone, in your own head. You go looking for the flaws in your own thinking. You take your most confident belief and stress test it. You argue against yourself. You seek out the strongest version of the opposing view, not to defeat it, but to find out if it might be right. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows that the least competent people are typically the most certain. But here's what's less discussed. At the highest end of competence, certainty drops again. The most knowledgeable people in any field are the most aware of how much they don't know. If you audit your own echo chamber because you actually want to know what's true, not because someone challenged you, that's a habit that puts you in a very small category. You treat emotions as information, not instruction. When you experience a strong emotion, anger, anxiety, sudden sadness, you don't merge with it and you don't suppress it. You get curious about it. You step back just enough to observe it and ask, what is this actually about? Not to dismiss it, to decode it. Because emotions are never random. Anxiety is always protecting something. Anger is always guarding something. Sudden sadness in a neutral moment is always pointing at something older than the current situation. Psychologists call this metacognition. The research is consistent. People who practice metacognitive reflection make better decisions, regulate emotions more effectively, and perform better under sustained pressure. The key distinction is this: I shouldn't feel this is suppression. I wonder what this is actually telling me is intelligence. You rewrite your own past deliberately. Memory is not a recording. Every time you recall a memory, you reconstruct it, and the emotional meaning you assign to it changes based on who you are now versus who you were then. Cognitive reappraisal means actively changing the meaning you assign to past events. Not denying they happened, not pretending they didn't hurt, finding a frame that's more accurate than the one you had at the time. The person you were at 22 didn't have the context to understand why certain things happened. The person you are now might. If you use solitude to revisit your history with new eyes, not to ruminate, but to genuinely revise your understanding, you are doing something most people never attempt. Subscribe if this kind of content is useful. There's more coming that builds directly on what we're covering here. You follow curiosity that has no practical application. It's midnight. You're supposed to be asleep. Instead, you're deep in a rabbit hole about Byzantine history, music theory, mathematics, or the evolutionary biology of color perception. Nobody asked. It won't help at work. There's no audience for this knowledge, and yet you can't stop. Psychologists call this autotelic motivation, pursuing something purely for its own sake with no external reward. And research consistently shows it as one of the strongest predictors of long-term creative output. Here's why it matters. Extrinsically motivated learning activates a fundamentally different cognitive process than intrinsically motivated learning. The connections form differently. The retention is different. The unexpected insights, the solutions that come from an apparently unrelated direction, almost always come from people with genuinely wide, non-strategic intellectual interests. If you learn things that will never make you $1 or impress anyone at a dinner party, your brain is doing something the productivity-obsessed culture has accidentally trained most people out of. You can stop your own thinking midstream. A thought starts, it builds momentum, the emotional logic feels undeniable, and then, before it reaches its conclusion, you catch it. You see the flaw in the reasoning, the pettiness in the reaction, the assumption that was never examined, and you stop. Not because someone challenged you. In an empty room, with no audience, with nothing to lose, you stop yourself. Neuroscientists call this inhibitory control. It's metabolically expensive. The brain would much rather complete the thought, win the internal argument, arrive at the satisfying conclusion. But if you can catch yourself mid-rumination and genuinely redirect, not pause and then continue, you have a degree of executive function that most people don't develop until very late in life, if ever. Here's what all 6 have in common. None of them are visible. None of them perform. None of them need an audience. Real cognitive depth works quietly in the background on the things that actually matter. The world has probably called you an overthinker, too much in your head, too slow to decide. They weren't wrong about the description. They were wrong about what it means. Which of these 6 do you practice most naturally when you're alone? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious whether these habits cluster together in the same people, or whether most people identify strongly with 1 or 2 and not the others. See you in the next one.